While I was flying back from burying my husband overseas, my sister decided it was the perfect time to break into my luxury penthouse. She sent me a picture of herself with a pry bar messaging, "Give me the smart lock code or I will break the door. I know you are in there ignoring me." When my parents found out what happened next, they screamed that I was a sick woman who lured her into a trap. But I just sat back and watched the security feed as my sister discovered the hard way that I had legally broken my lease 2 weeks earlier, and the new tenant living there was a heavily armed United States Marshal. My name is Naomi, 34 years old, and a corporate crisis manager in Chicago. My entire life has been spent putting out fires for massive companies, but the biggest disasters I ever faced were the ones my own blood relatives created. I stood at O'Hare International Airport, staring at my phone through eyes burned red from crying. I had just survived a grueling 14-hour flight from London, returning home only days after the sudden, unexpected death of my husband Thomas. He suffered a massive heart attack on a business trip, and I had to fly out to navigate foreign hospitals, repatriate his remains, and handle the worst nightmare of my existence, completely alone. Exhausted to my bones, shivering in the arrivals terminal, I pulled up our family group chat. I typed a simple message. "Flight just landed at 5. Can someone please pick me up? I am running on empty." I watched the read receipts pop up almost instantly. My brother Kevin replied first. "We are busy. Try Uber." A minute later, my mother Nancy chimed in. "Why did you not plan better? You know how hectic things are for us right now." I stood there as passengers pushed past me, reuniting with their loved ones, hugging and crying. I was a widow, physically and emotionally shattered, standing alone in a cold airport, and my family could not be bothered to drive 40 minutes to get me. I did not argue. I did not beg. I simply typed, "No worries." I locked my phone, recognizing the absolute chilling finality of their indifference. They did not care that I was grieving. They only cared about what I could provide for them. Before I continue this story, let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Hit like and subscribe if your family only reaches out when they need your money, and stay tuned to hear how my refusal to be a doormat landed my golden child sister in federal prison. To understand how my family could leave me stranded at the airport days after losing my husband, you have to understand the dynamic that ruled our household. In my family, I was the human bank account. I was the reliable, financially successful daughter who was expected to absorb every hardship and fund every whim. My younger sister Brittany, on the other hand, was the golden child. At 31 years old, Brittany lived exclusively for social media validation. She wanted a lifestyle she could not afford, and my parents, William and Nancy, made it their life mission to ensure she got it, usually at my expense. Exactly 1 month ago, before Thomas passed away, the tension reached a boiling point. Brittany and her husband DeAndre, a hardworking African-American IT specialist, had come over to visit my luxury downtown Chicago penthouse. DeAndre was a good man, steady and respectful, but he was completely manipulated by Brittany. As we sat in my living room overlooking the city skyline, Brittany dropped her ridiculous demand. "Since you and Thomas are making 7 figures, you should just hand over the lease to this penthouse to me," Brittany announced, swirling her wine glass. "It is much closer to DeAndre's office, and it will shorten my commute to the city. Plus, my followers would die for this view. You guys can easily downgrade to something in the suburbs." I stared at her genuinely, thinking she was joking. "You want me to give you my home so you can take photos for the internet? It makes practical sense, Naomi." She whined, her tone shifting to that familiar entitled pitch. "You have so much. Why are you always so selfish with your blessings?" I flatly refused. I told her I worked 80 hours a week dealing with corporate meltdowns to afford my lifestyle, and I was not giving up my home to fund her aesthetic. Brittany stormed out, dragging a very confused DeAndre with her. 10 minutes later, my phone rang. It was my father, William. He did not ask for my side of the story. He immediately started screaming, "You make millions of dollars. Giving your sister a rented apartment is the least you can do. She is family. You should want to see her thrive. Why do you always have to be such a cold, calculating machine?" My mother grabbed the phone, her voice dripping with guilt-inducing poison. Your sister deserves to live comfortably. You know DeAndre is working so hard in IT and they need a better place. If you cared about anyone but yourself, you would hand over those keys today. That was how they operated. They weaponized my success to subsidize Brittany's delusions. For years, I had paid her credit card bills, bailed her out of bad car loans, and covered my parents' vacations. But demanding the literal roof over my head was the final straw. I realized then that to them, I was not a daughter or a sister. I was a resource, and resources do not have feelings. They do not get to grieve. They only exist to be consumed. Sitting in the back of an Uber, watching the city lights blur through the rain-streaked window, I thought about that argument. I thought about Thomas, the only person who had truly loved me without conditions, and how he had constantly urged me to cut them off. He used to tell me, Naomi, boundaries are not negotiations. You have to stop setting yourself on fire to keep them warm. I wiped my eyes and stared at my phone screen. They thought leaving me at the airport would break me. They thought I would come crawling back desperate for their approval, willing to hand over the penthouse just to feel like part of the family again. But they had vastly underestimated the woman they were dealing with. They thought they were punishing me. They had no idea that their cruelty had finally severed the last thread of obligation I felt toward them. I had already set my silent exit strategy into motion weeks ago, right after that horrific argument, and just before Thomas passed. I knew my family would never stop harassing me for the penthouse. I knew Brittany would cross any line to get what she wanted. So I took myself out of the equation entirely. I was about to teach them a brutal lesson in federal law, and the best part was, I did not have to lift a single finger to do it. The execution of my silent exit strategy began the morning after that explosive phone call with my father. As a corporate crisis manager, my entire career revolves around mitigating catastrophic liabilities. My family had officially become a liability I could no longer afford to manage. I did not shed another tear over their demands. Instead, I treated them like a hostile entity attempting a corporate takeover. I walked into the property management office of my downtown luxury high-rise the very next day. I informed the building director that I was terminating my lease 2 months early. He warned me about the severe financial penalties sliding a contract across his mahogany desk that outlined a $15,000 fee for breaking the agreement. I pulled out my checkbook and paid it on the spot. My decisive action actually worked in the building's favor. The property manager looked at the check, then looked up at me with a mix of surprise and relief. He confessed that they had been desperately trying to find an available unit on a high-security floor for a VIP client who needed immediate placement. That client was David Cole, a high-ranking United States Marshal who had just been transferred to Chicago. He was overseeing a highly classified federal witness protection operation and required a residence with restricted elevator access, reinforced doors, and absolute privacy. My penthouse, occupying a secluded corner of the top floor, was the perfect tactical fit. I signed the release forms, handed over my digital key fobs, and legally surrendered the property. Over the next 48 hours, I orchestrated a completely untraceable relocation. I purchased a heavily secured smart home in a quiet, heavily wooded suburb outside the city. To ensure my parents and sister could never look up public property records to find me, I bought the house under a blind LLC. I hired a private premium moving company to pack up my entire life in the dead of night. By the time the sun rose on the third day, the luxury penthouse was completely empty, professionally cleaned, and handed over to the federal government. I left absolutely no forwarding address. I deliberately chose not to block my family's phone numbers. Blocking them would have signaled a reaction. It would have shown them that their words had an impact. Instead, I simply muted their notifications and let them scream into the void. Over the following weeks, my mother and father left dozens of furious voicemails, alternating between demanding I hand over the apartment keys to Brittany and guilt-tripping me for ignoring my family duties. I never responded. My silence allowed them to construct their own twisted narrative. In their minds, my lack of response was just me being stubborn. They convinced themselves that I would eventually cave to their pressure just like I always had in the past. Now sitting in the back of the Uber heading away from the airport, the exhaustion of the past few weeks threatened to pull me under. My husband was gone. The man who had been my anchor was buried thousands of miles away. My body ached from the 14-hour flight, and my eyes stung from relentless tears. I rested my head against the cold glass of the car window, watching the rain-slicked streets of Chicago blur past. I just wanted to reach my new quiet house and collapse into a bed that did not smell like hospital antiseptics. Then my phone vibrated in my lap. It was not a text from a friend offering condolences. It was a picture message from Brittany. I opened the notification and felt a surge of pure, icy adrenaline slice through my exhaustion. The photo showed Brittany standing in the hallway right outside the door of my former penthouse. She was wearing a smug, triumphant smile, striking a pose for the camera. Behind her stood her husband, DeAndre. He was holding two heavy cardboard moving boxes, looking exhausted but compliant. A second message popped up immediately after the photo. "Give me the smart lock code. I know you are in there ignoring me. Mom said you agreed to move out and let us have the place. Open up right now or I am calling a locksmith." I stared at the screen, my mind rapidly processing the sheer audacity of her delusion. Brittany had actually packed up her belongings, hired a moving truck, and dragged her husband to a luxury high-rise based entirely on a lie she had fabricated. She knew I had not agreed to anything. She knew I had flatly refused her demand a month ago. But her entitlement was a sickness. She believed that if she just showed up and forced the issue, I would surrender to avoid a public scene in my upscale building. She thought she could bully her way into $1 million view. What chilled me most was looking at DeAndre in the background of the photo. DeAndre was a good man. He worked long hours in IT, paid his taxes, and treated people with respect. He had always been polite to me, completely unaware of the toxic manipulation running through my family's veins. Through a series of frantic, confused voicemails that DeAndre had left on my phone while I was flying over the Atlantic, I pieced together the horrific lie Brittany had spun. She had told DeAndre that I was gifting them the remaining months on my lease as a belated wedding present. She told him I was moving to the suburbs because I wanted a fresh start after my husband's death, and that I wanted my little sister to have the city apartment she had always dreamed of. DeAndre believed he was simply carrying boxes into a home his wife had legitimately acquired. He had no idea that he was standing in front of a restricted federal residence. He had no idea that the woman he married was turning him into an unwitting accomplice in a major crime. My phone vibrated again. Another text from Brittany. "I am not playing games, Naomi. Give me the code or I am using a pry bar to break this lock. You are not keeping me out of my new home." She was fully unhinged, high on the adrenaline of her own manufactured reality. She was about to cross the threshold from being an entitled, spoiled sibling to becoming an active threat to a federal officer. I did not reply to her text. I did not call the police to warn them. I simply opened the building's security application on my phone. The property management had not yet revoked my digital access to the hallway surveillance feeds. I clicked on the camera covering the top floor corridor, holding my breath, as the live video loaded on my screen, waiting for the inevitable collision between my sister's reckless entitlement and the unforgiving reality of federal law. The live video feed buffered for a split second before snapping into crystal clear high definition. I sat in the back of my Uber, the rain drumming against the roof, watching my sister pace the hallway outside my former penthouse. Brittany was furious, jabbing her thumb against her phone screen. A moment later, my own phone began to vibrate violently in my hand. The caller ID flashed with my father's name. I let it go to voicemail. 2 seconds later, my mother called. I declined that one as well. I knew exactly what they were doing. They were executing their standard pressure cooker tactic, flooding me with hostility until I broke. A voicemail notification popped up. I tapped the play button, keeping my eyes glued to the security feed. My mother's voice shrieked through the tiny speaker, her tone dripping with venom. "Naomi, stop acting like a petulant child. Your sister has a locksmith on the way. She is freezing in the hallway with DeAndre. Stop being difficult and text her the code right now. Your father is furious. You are ruining what should be a happy day for your sister. I felt my heart rate slow to a steady rhythmic beat. I opened our family group chat. I typed one final definitive message. I no longer live there. Whatever happens next is your own fault. I hit send, switched my phone to Do Not Disturb, and returned to the camera feed. On the screen, Brittany looked down at her phone. I watched her face contort into a mask of pure rage as she read my message. She shoved her phone into her designer purse and turned to DeAndre. Even through the silent video feed, I could see the aggressive, theatrical way she was throwing her hands around. She was spinning a new lie right there on the spot. DeAndre looked exhausted. He set down the heavy moving boxes he had been carrying and rubbed the back of his neck. He was clearly suggesting they just leave and wait for me to calm down. But Brittany was not going to leave. She had already promised her social media followers a luxury penthouse tour. Her ego was on the line, and in her world, her ego was the only thing that mattered. I watched as Brittany stormed away from the door and disappeared down the hall toward the service elevator. A minute later, she returned carrying a heavy steel pry bar, likely grabbed from the moving truck parked downstairs. DeAndre's eyes went wide. He immediately stepped in front of the door, holding his hands up, clearly pleading with her to stop. The building's security cameras did not capture clear audio, but his body language was unmistakable. He was a rational man, realizing his wife was about to cross a very dangerous line. But Brittany shoved him hard in the chest. She pointed her finger in his face, her mouth moving in rapid, angry bursts. She was telling him that the apartment was hers, that I was just throwing a jealous fit, and that she had every right to claim what she was owed. DeAndre, worn down by her relentless manipulation and desperate to avoid a public screaming match in a luxury high-rise hallway, slowly backed away. He surrendered to her delusion. Brittany stepped up to the reinforced door. She wedged the pry bar straight into the gap between the heavy door frame and the electronic smart lock casing. I watched entirely detached as my sister committed a federal felony. She put her entire body weight into the pry bar. The expensive metal lock casing groaned under the pressure, then violently buckled. She yanked the tool backward with a vicious grunt, snapping the internal mechanism. The heavy door clicked loudly and swung open a few inches. Brittany dropped the pry bar onto the carpeted floor. She immediately reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, and adjusted her hair. She tapped the screen, undoubtedly hitting the button to go live on her social media accounts. I could practically see her fake, cheerful influencer smile as she pushed the door wide open and marched across the threshold, beaming at her phone camera to announce her grand entrance into her new luxury life. DeAndre picked up one of the moving boxes and followed her inside. I quickly switched my view to the camera positioned in the penthouse foyer. The property management had left my administrative access intact for another 24 hours to ensure my transition was smooth, giving me a front row seat to the disaster. The moment DeAndre stepped into the entryway, he froze. He stopped dead in his tracks, the heavy cardboard box dipping slightly in his grip. He was looking around the living room, and I knew exactly what he was seeing. The sleek, feminine decor I had owned was completely gone. In its place was stark utilitarian furniture. But that was not what made the blood drain from DeAndre's face. Draped casually over one of the dining room chairs was a heavy Kevlar tactical vest. Bold yellow letters across the back spelled out U.S. Marshal. Sitting on the kitchen island was a secured government-issued communication radio. DeAndre dropped the box. It hit the hardwood floor with a heavy, echoing thud. He realized instantly that he had not just broken into his sister-in-law's apartment. He had broken into the highly classified residence of a federal agent. Brittany, completely oblivious to her surroundings and entirely focused on the screen of her phone, kept walking forward, panning her camera around the room. She was talking to her followers, boasting about the high ceilings and the beautiful skyline view, entirely blind to the federal tactical gear sitting less than 10 feet away from her. Then the door to the master bedroom flew open. David Cole stepped out. He was a towering, imposing man with the kind of rigid posture that comes from years of military and federal law enforcement training. He was wearing dark tactical pants and a plain black shirt, looking exhausted from his protection detail. But the moment he saw two unauthorized individuals standing in his secure living room, his exhaustion vanished instantly. His reaction was immediate and absolute. He did not ask them what they were doing. He did not politely inquire if they were lost. He identified a breached door, a pry bar on the floor, and two intruders inside a highly classified safe house. David drew his service weapon with terrifying speed. He aimed it squarely at center mass, his voice booming through the apartment with the force of a thunderclap. I could read his lips perfectly on the security feed. Get on the ground. Get on the ground right now. Brittany spun around, her phone still recording. She saw a massive man aiming a gun at her, and blinded by a lifetime of absolute privilege and parental shielding, she did the stupidest thing imaginable. She did not comply. She took an aggressive step toward him, pointing her manicured finger, and began screaming that this was her sister's house and she was calling the police on him. David did not flinch. He reached to his belt and slammed his hand against his federal panic alarm, initiating a signal that would send every armed officer in a 5-mile radius crashing down on my sister's head. The heavy slam of the Uber door felt like a physical barrier dropping between my past and my future. I sank into the cold leather seat, the hum of the engine vibrating through my exhausted bones as we pulled away from O'Hare International Airport. Rain lashed against the tinted windows, blurring the city lights into streaks of neon. I was a 34-year-old widow who had just buried her husband, running on zero sleep, but my mind was operating with the cold mechanical precision of a corporate crisis manager. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. It was time to assess the damage. During the 14-hour flight from London, I had kept my device on airplane mode to preserve my sanity. Now, as the cellular network reconnected, the screen instantly froze. The processor struggled to handle the sheer volume of incoming data. A barrage of chimes, buzzes, and alert tones erupted in the quiet cabin of the car. My driver glanced at me through the rearview mirror, but I waved him off with a quick apology. I watched the notification counter on my messaging app climb from a dozen to over 50 in a matter of seconds. It was a coordinated digital assault. I opened the family group chat first. I bypassed the initial dismissive remarks about me taking an Uber and scrolled straight to the media attachments. There was a photo sent exactly 20 minutes ago. I tapped the image to enlarge it, and a wave of icy disbelief washed over me. It was a selfie taken by my sister Brittany. She was standing in the familiar, softly lit hallway of my former luxury downtown penthouse. She was wearing a designer trench coat, her hair perfectly styled, sporting a smug, entitled smirk that I had seen 1,000 times before. But it was the background of the image that made my pulse quicken. Behind her stood her husband, DeAndre. He looked incredibly out of place, balancing two massive, heavy cardboard moving boxes in his arms. He was wearing his work clothes, clearly having rushed straight from his IT job to carry out this ridiculous errand. He looked tired and confused, completely unaware of the radioactive legal trap he was currently standing in. Beneath the photo, a string of text messages from Brittany followed in rapid succession. "Give me the smart lock code. I know you are in there ignoring me. Mom said you agreed to move out and let us have the place. Stop throwing a tantrum and open up, or I'm calling a locksmith." I read the words again, letting the sheer, unfiltered insanity of her demands sink into my brain. Mom said you agreed to move out. That specific sentence echoed in my mind. It was the ultimate manifestation of my family's toxic delusion. They wanted my apartment for Brittany so badly that they had literally willed it into existence in their own minds. My mother Nancy, completely unburdened by facts or reality, had simply told Brittany that the apartment was hers. And Brittany, who had never been told no a single day in her 31 years of life, just blindly accepted it. She actually packed her belongings, rented a moving truck, and dragged her African-American husband to my former address under the absolute conviction that she could simply claim a multi-million-dollar property because she wanted it. This was no longer just a spoiled sibling throwing a tantrum over a borrowed sweater or a stolen vacation. This was a calculated home invasion. Brittany had completely lost her grip on reality. She was staging a break-in under the psychotic delusion of familial entitlement. She genuinely believed that because we shared the same blood, the laws of property leasing agreements and basic human decency did not apply to her. As a crisis manager, I am trained to evaluate threats by their potential for escalation. I stared at the selfie again, zooming in on the heavy metal pry bar peeking out of Brittany's designer tote bag. She was not planning to wait for a locksmith. She brought her own tools. She was fully prepared to destroy a commercial-grade security door to get what she wanted. My family had finally crossed the line from emotionally abusive to criminally dangerous. My phone vibrated again with an incoming text from my father, William. "Stop being a selfish brat and let your sister inside. She is freezing in the hallway. DeAndre has to work in the morning. Give her the access code before I come down there and make you do it." I did not type a response. I did not engage. Engaging with narcissists only validates their twisted reality. If I replied and told them I no longer lived there, they would call me a liar. If I tried to explain the legal peril they were putting DeAndre in, they would accuse me of making empty threats. They had spent my entire life gaslighting me, manipulating every situation to make me the villain and Brittany the victim. I was done playing my assigned role in their sick family play. My husband, Thomas, was dead. The one person who brought warmth and sanity to my world had been buried in foreign soil. I had nothing left to lose and absolutely no more patience to give. The grief that had been threatening to crush my chest suddenly hardened into a protective shield of pure logic. I realized that the best way to handle a crisis of this magnitude was not to stop it, but to let it run its inevitable course. I leaned back against the leather seat of the Uber. I watched the rain droplets race across the window glass, mapping out the precise legal consequences of what was about to happen. Brittany thought she was breaking into her wealthy sister's apartment to claim her rightful throne. She had no idea that the property management had already leased that exact unit to the federal government. She had no idea that behind that heavy oak door was a United States Marshal assigned to a classified witness protection detail. I looked down at the smug selfie of my sister one last time. She wanted my life so badly that she was willing to steal it. I locked my screen, took a slow, deep breath, and prepared to watch her burn her own life to the ground. Let her break the lock. Let her claim her prize. The trap was set, and I was not going to lift a single finger to stop the jaws from snapping shut. I kept my eyes fixed on the glowing screen of my phone, the soft hum of the Uber tires on the wet asphalt, providing a steady rhythm to my racing thoughts. While the family group chat remained a toxic wasteland of demands and insults from my parents, my voicemail inbox told a completely different, far more disturbing story. I had 5 new voice messages. I expected them all to be from my father William or my mother Nancy, screaming more empty threats about calling the authorities on me for being a bad sister. Instead, the screen displayed a different name, DeAndre. My thumb hovered over the play button. DeAndre rarely called me. In the 3 years he had been married to my sister, we had maintained a cordial but distant relationship. He was a quiet, hardworking IT specialist, a man who spent his days troubleshooting server networks and his evenings trying to navigate the chaotic storm that was my family. He had always treated me with genuine respect, never once asking for money or favors. Knowing he was standing in that hallway holding moving boxes made a tight knot form in my stomach. I pressed play and lifted the phone to my ear. DeAndre's voice filled the quiet space of the car, and what I heard made my blood run absolutely cold. "Naomi, hey, it is DeAndre. I know you are probably still exhausted from the flight back from London, so I will keep this quick. I just wanted to call and say thank you. Seriously, thank you from the bottom of my heart. Brittany told me the news this morning about you transferring the rest of the penthouse lease to us as a belated wedding present. I could not believe it when she said you wanted us to have the place so my commute to the tech firm would be shorter. That is the most generous thing anyone has ever done for us." I took the afternoon off work to help her move the first load of boxes. "We are heading over there now. I know losing Thomas has been incredibly hard on you, and for you to think of us during your grief, it just means a lot. Call me when you get settled." The message ended. I lowered the phone, staring blankly at the back of the driver's headrest. The sheer magnitude of my sister's deception hit me like a physical blow. Brittany had not just lied to my parents to get them on her side. She had engineered a massive, legally catastrophic lie to manipulate her own husband. She looked DeAndre right in the eyes and told him I was gifting them a multi-million-dollar lease. She used my dead husband as a prop in her fictional narrative, twisting my tragedy into a story about my supposed generosity. DeAndre, being a decent, rational human being, believed his wife. Why would he not believe her? No sane person would invent a lie of that magnitude and actually drive to the location with moving boxes unless it were true. DeAndre was a man who prided himself on his integrity. He had spent years studying, earning his certifications, and building a respectable career in a highly competitive industry. He avoided trouble at all costs. The fact that Brittany was willing to leverage his pristine reputation, his freedom, and his very life for a brief moment of online fame was a level of sociopathy I had not fully comprehended until this exact moment. I tapped the screen to play the second voicemail left 45 minutes after the first. "Hey Naomi, it is DeAndre again. We are up on your floor outside the penthouse, but the smart lock code Brittany gave me is not working. The keypad keeps flashing red. Brittany said she might have written down the temporary code wrong, or maybe the building management reset the system after you left for London. Can you shoot me a text with the updated code when you get a second? Brittany is getting a little frustrated and these boxes are pretty heavy. Anyway, no rush, just let us know. Thanks again." I listened to the message twice. I could hear the genuine confusion in his voice, completely devoid of the malicious entitlement that fueled my sister. He thought this was a simple technical glitch. He thought he was standing outside his new legitimate home. As a crisis manager, my job is to analyze collateral damage. DeAndre was currently standing in a high-security luxury building, completely unauthorized, preparing to participate in a break-in. In modern America, an African-American man forcing entry into a restricted luxury high-rise is a situation that can escalate to fatal consequences in seconds. Brittany was not just risking a trespassing charge, she was actively placing her husband's life in extreme jeopardy to feed her social media addiction. My finger hovered over the keypad. For a fleeting second, the urge to intervene flared up. I could call DeAndre right now. I could tell him the truth. I could warn him that his wife is a pathological liar, that I never gifted them the lease, and that he is standing outside the home of a federal agent. I could tell him to drop the boxes and run for his life. But the cold, calculating part of my brain took over. If I called DeAndre, Brittany would snatch the phone. She would scream that I was changing my mind, that I was a liar, and my parents would immediately back her up. The toxic cycle would reset. I would be dragged right back into the endless, exhausting vortex of their manipulation. More importantly, DeAndre needed to see Brittany for exactly who she was. If I stopped the train from crashing, he would never understand the true danger of the woman he married. He would continue to be her pawn, oblivious to the destruction she left in her wake. I had to let the illusion shatter. I had to let him walk into the fire, but I could make sure he did not burn to ash. I quickly opened my phone settings and securely backed up the audio files of DeAndre's voicemails to my encrypted cloud storage. These recordings were his ultimate salvation. They were the undeniable, legally binding proof that he lacked criminal intent. They proved he was operating under the false pretense of a gifted lease constructed entirely by his wife. When the authorities eventually interrogated him, this audio would be the absolute difference between a felony breaking and entering charge and walking away as a defrauded victim. I hit save and watched the progress bar hit 100%. The evidence was secure. My screen lit up with a third voicemail from DeAndre. I pressed it to my ear, bracing myself for what I knew was coming. "Naomi, please pick up the phone." DeAndre's voice was no longer calm or grateful. It was laced with tight, rising panic. "Brittany is losing her mind out here. She went down to the truck and grabbed a steel pry bar. I told her to stop, to just wait for you to call us back, but she will not listen to me. She keeps saying Mom and Dad told her she has the right to go inside. Naomi, she is trying to force the door. Please answer the phone and tell her to stop before someone calls the cops." The audio clipped out, followed immediately by the harsh sound of metal scraping against metal. Then the line went dead. I lowered the phone to my lap. The die was cast. Brittany had moved past verbal demands and entered the realm of physical destruction. DeAndre was now trapped in a scenario he could not control, tied to a wife who cared more about her online aesthetic than his safety. The countdown had started, and there was no aborting the mission now. I turned my attention back to the building security application, my eyes fixed on the live feed waiting for the heavy oak door to break. My eyes were locked on the live security feed waiting for the heavy oak door to give way when a massive wave of incoming data hijacked my screen. The video feed minimized. An incoming call from my father took over the display. I declined it instantly. A second later, a call from my mother completely blocked my view of the security application. I declined that one too. They were launching their signature tactic. I used to call it the parental pressure cooker. It was a highly coordinated, relentless harassment campaign designed to break my resolve through sheer volume and psychological warfare. Whenever Brittany wanted something outrageous, and I dared to say no, my parents would tag team my phone until I was so emotionally exhausted that handing over my money, my time, or my property felt easier than enduring the abuse. My screen filled with a rapid-fire sequence of text messages. The notification banners dropped down one after another like a digital avalanche. William, answer your phone right now. You are acting like a petulant teenager. William, Brittany is standing in the hallway because of your stubbornness. You are a petty, jealous sister, and you always have been. William, you make 7 figures. You can afford to live anywhere in the state. Hand over the access code. Do not make me drive downtown to handle this myself. The sheer audacity of his words washed over me. He was sitting comfortably in his suburban living room, demanding that I surrender a multi-million-dollar lease to a woman who had never worked a full-time job in her life. He called me petty and jealous. I had just buried the love of my life overseas. I was currently sitting in the back of a rideshare vehicle in wet clothes, completely hollowed out by grief, and my father was accusing me of being jealous. The absolute disconnect from reality was staggering. Then my mother joined the assault. A voicemail notification chimed. Nancy had realized I was not going to pick up the phone, so she resorted to leaving a recorded threat. I tapped the icon holding the phone to my ear while the rain continued to beat against the windows of the Uber. Naomi. I have had absolutely enough of this behavior, my mother hissed, her voice vibrating with a terrifying mixture of rage and manufactured panic. Your sister is exhausted. DeAndre is tired. They have moving boxes, and you are treating them like criminals. Brittany just told me that the smart lock is malfunctioning, and you are refusing to help. Well, your sister has a locksmith on the way. Stop being difficult and text the code. You promised her this apartment, and you are going to honor your word. Send the code right now, or you are no longer welcome in this family. I pulled the phone away from my ear. I stared at the audio playback bar as the message ended. My mother was lying, and she knew she was lying. I had never promised Brittany the apartment. We both knew that. But my mother had repeated the lie so many times to extended family members, to Brittany, and likely to herself, that it had mutated into absolute truth in her mind. Furthermore, the threat of a locksmith was completely laughable. No legitimate licensed locksmith in the city of Chicago would ever drill into a federal-grade security door in a luxury high-rise without verifying the leaseholder's identification and matching it to a government-issued ID. Brittany knew a locksmith would demand proof of residency, which was exactly why she had abandoned that idea and resorted to using a stolen pry bar. My mother was simply regurgitating Brittany's initial bluff, trying to use it as a weapon to force my hand. They wanted to use the threat of being cast out of the family as their ultimate leverage. For 34 years, that threat had worked. I had spent my entire adult life desperately trying to earn their love, throwing money at their problems, fixing Brittany's endless mistakes, all to buy a fleeting moment of parental approval. But sitting in that car listening to the absolute lack of empathy in my mother's voice, the final chain snapped. I did not care if I was welcome in their family anymore. Their family was a parasite, and I was the host they were trying to bleed dry. I opened the main family group chat. The screen was a chaotic wall of green and gray text bubbles filled with insults, demands, and massive amounts of emotional manipulation. I tapped the text box. I did not write a lengthy explanation. I did not defend my choices. I did not mention Thomas or my grief, or the fact that I had just spent 30 hours navigating international customs to bring my husband's belongings home. Explanations are for people who are willing to listen. My family only wanted compliance. I typed exactly 12 words. I no longer live there. Whatever happens next is your own fault. I hit send. I watched the small read receipts appear at the bottom of the screen. William read it. Nancy read it. I knew exactly how they would react. They would laugh. They would assume I was lying to scare them off. They would convince themselves that this was just another one of my pathetic attempts to establish a boundary they fully intended to bulldoze right over. They would urge Brittany to keep pushing, certain that I was bluffing. I did not wait for their furious replies. I accessed my phone settings and navigated to the control panel. With one decisive swipe of my thumb, I toggled the Do Not Disturb feature. The relentless buzzing stopped. The notifications vanished. The chaotic barrage of family toxicity was instantly silenced, replaced by the quiet, steady rhythm of the rain outside my window and the smooth jazz playing faintly from the driver's radio. The sudden digital silence was intoxicating. It felt like I had just stepped out of a suffocating smoke-filled room and taken my very first breath of pure, clean air. I maximized the property management security application on my screen. The live feed from the top-floor hallway reloaded. The buffer wheel spun for a fraction of a second before the high-definition image stabilized. My access had not been revoked yet. The property manager had promised me 24 hours of administrative clearance to ensure my moving crew had completely cleared the premises. That 24-hour window was proving to be the most valuable asset I had ever retained. I leaned forward, my eyes locking onto the live video feed. I was entirely undisturbed now, completely insulated from the frantic demands of my parents. The trap I had unknowingly set, by simply refusing to be their victim anymore, was primed. All that was left was for the golden child to pull the trigger. I watched the screen, waiting for the inevitable moment my sister decided to break the law. The glowing screen of my smartphone illuminated the dark interior of the Uber. I watched the high-definition security feed. Brittany paced back and forth across the custom carpet. Her initial smugness had evaporated, replaced by a frantic, jagged energy. She checked her phone constantly, likely refreshing the family group chat, waiting for my parents to confirm that they had successfully bullied me into submission. But my digital silence was absolute. I had cut the cord, and Brittany was beginning to realize that her usual tactics were failing. She knew she could not call a locksmith. That threat was entirely hollow. Any licensed professional operating in downtown Chicago would demand proof of residency before touching a commercial-grade security door. Brittany had no lease, no utility bill, and no identification linking her to the address. She was trapped in the hallway with her lies, and her patience had completely run out. I watched her turn toward the service elevator. She stomped down the corridor, disappearing from the camera's field of view. DeAndre remained by the door, standing awkwardly next to the towering stack of moving boxes. He pulled out his own phone, likely checking to see if I had responded to his desperate voicemails. I saw his shoulders slump when his screen remained blank. He looked like a man who just wanted to go home, rest, and prepare for his upcoming work week. He had no idea his week was about to be spent navigating the federal justice system. A few minutes later, the service elevator doors parted on the security feed. Brittany marched back into the frame, and my breath caught slightly in my throat. She was no longer carrying her designer handbag. Gripped tightly in her right hand was a massive, heavy-duty steel pry bar. She must have gone down to the loading dock and retrieved it from the back of their rented moving truck. The situation had just escalated from a delusional misunderstanding to a premeditated criminal act. DeAndre saw the weapon and physically recoiled. Even without audio, his shock was palpable. He dropped his phone into his pocket and stepped directly in front of the penthouse door, using his body as a human shield between my sister and the biometric lock. He raised both his hands, palms facing outward in a universal gesture of de-escalation. He was talking fast, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. I could easily read the logic failing in his mind. He was asking her why she had a crowbar. He was telling her to stop, to just wait for me to call them back to handle this like rational adults. But Brittany was not a rational adult. She was a narcissist who had been denied her prize. She stepped directly into DeAndre's personal space, pointing her finger aggressively at his chest. Her face was contorted with absolute fury. I watched my sister berate her husband in the hallway. She was undoubtedly spinning her web of lies faster than he could process them. She was likely telling him that the apartment was legally hers, that I was just throwing a jealous, grieving temper tantrum, and that my parents had explicitly given her permission to do whatever it took to get inside. DeAndre shook his head, gesturing toward the elevator, pleading with her to just walk away. He was a smart, law-abiding man who recognized the inherent danger of forcing entry into a building where they did not hold the keys. He tried to gently place his hand on her wrist to lower the pry bar. Brittany violently shoved him away. She pushed her husband with enough force that he stumbled backward, nearly tripping over one of the heavy cardboard boxes. DeAndre caught his balance, his face displaying a mixture of profound embarrassment and alarming realization. He held his hands up in a gesture of surrender, stepping away from the door. He was exhausted, worn down by her relentless aggression, and desperate to avoid a screaming match that would draw the attention of the wealthy neighbors or building security. He yielded to her madness, stepping back against the opposite wall to watch. Brittany turned her attention back to the reinforced door. The penthouse utilized a commercial-grade electronic smart lock system housed in a thick brushed steel casing. It was designed to withstand significant force, but it was not entirely invincible against blunt, sustained trauma. She wedged the flat chisel end of the heavy pry bar straight into the narrow gap between the heavy oak door and the steel door frame, right where the electronic deadbolt mechanism was housed. I leaned closer to my phone screen, watching my sister cross the ultimate point of no return. She threw her entire body weight against the steel bar. The camera captured the violent, jerky motion of her pulling the lever toward herself. The metal frame groaned under the immense pressure. She repositioned the pry bar, jamming it deeper into the crevice, and threw her weight into it again. She was relentless, fueled by a lifetime of never facing a single consequence for her actions. On the third violent thrust, the expensive metal casing of the smart lock finally buckled. The internal deadbolt mechanism snapped with a forceful, visible jolt that rippled through the heavy door. The electronic keypad flashed a rapid sequence of error lights before going completely dark. The heavy oak door drifted open, exposing the dark entryway of the penthouse. Brittany dropped the pry bar onto the plush hallway carpet with a muted thud. She immediately smoothed down the front of her trench coat, reached into her pocket, and pulled out her smartphone. In an instant, the manic, destructive fury on her face vanished seamlessly, replaced by the bright, artificial smile of an internet influencer preparing to address her audience. She tapped the screen, initiating a live broadcast for her social media followers. The crime was complete. The legal boundary had been officially and irreparably shattered. What started as a family dispute over a lease had just escalated into a felony charge of breaking and entering. She pushed the damaged door wide open and marched across the threshold, practically vibrating with triumph. She was stepping into what she believed was her newly conquered kingdom. DeAndre hesitated in the hallway for an agonizing few seconds, staring at the broken lock casing before reluctantly bending down to pick up the moving boxes. He followed his wife into the dark apartment, entirely unaware that he was stepping directly into a federal nightmare. I kept my eyes fixed on the screen, waiting for the camera feed inside the foyer to catch the exact moment their delusion violently collided with reality. The trap had sprung, and there was absolutely no turning back for anyone involved now. I watched closely, waiting for the inevitable crash to occur in mere seconds. I tapped the screen of my smartphone, switching the security application feed from the exterior hallway to the interior foyer camera. The application instantly loaded the interior view of the penthouse. The high-definition lens captured the exact moment my sister crossed the threshold, stepping over the shattered pieces of the electronic lock casing she had just destroyed. She pushed the heavy oak door wide open, marching into the entryway, with the supreme confidence of a conquering general claiming her spoils. She held her phone high above her head, the screen angled perfectly to capture her face and the expansive background of the luxury apartment. She was already broadcasting live to her social media followers, entirely consumed by her own manufactured reality. She did not bother to turn on the overhead lights, relying instead on the sweeping ambient glow of the Chicago skyline pouring in through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. "Welcome to the new era, everyone," Brittany announced to her digital audience, her voice practically vibrating with synthetic joy. "I am officially moving into my new downtown penthouse. Manifesting this luxury lifestyle has been such a journey, but when you know your worth, the universe always delivers." I watched the screen in absolute silence from the back of my Uber. The level of narcissistic blindness required to stand inside a stolen apartment and claim it as a spiritual victory was staggering. She panned the camera around the spacious living room, giving her followers a grand tour of a space she had no legal right to occupy. What struck me immediately was her complete lack of reaction to the environment itself. The penthouse looked entirely different from the last time she had visited. My plush velvet sofas, abstract artwork, and delicate glass tables were completely gone. In their place sat stark utilitarian furniture. Dark leather recliners, heavy oak end tables, and minimalist lamps filled the room. There were no decorative pillows, no soft rugs, no personal touches of any kind. It was the sterile, highly functional setup of a government safe house. Brittany did not care. She barely even registered the change. She simply aimed her phone at the heavy leather sofa and laughed into the camera. My sister left some seriously ugly staging furniture behind, but do not worry, guys. We are going to redecorate this entire place and make it absolutely perfect. I will be doing a full interior design series, so stay tuned. 10 seconds later, DeAndre stepped through the broken door frame. The contrast between my sister and her husband was jarring. While Brittany pranced around the room seeking digital validation, DeAndre moved with cautious, heavy steps. He was carrying a large cardboard moving box, his breathing visibly labored from the physical exertion of hauling it from the service elevator. He walked into the foyer and used his foot to push the damaged front door shut behind him. The door bounced off the warped steel frame, refusing to latch properly. DeAndre set the heavy box down on the hardwood floor with a soft thud. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead and finally looked up, taking in the living room for the first time. Through the security feed, I witnessed the exact moment his IT-trained, detail-oriented brain began to process the glaring anomalies around him. He looked at the stark leather furniture. He looked at the bare walls. He looked at the heavy-duty blackout curtains that had been newly installed over the floor-to-ceiling windows. His brow furrowed in deep confusion. This did not look like the home of a wealthy corporate executive. It looked like a tactical command center. DeAndre took a few tentative steps further into the dining area, leaving Brittany to continue her monologue near the windows. He approached the large dining table, which was currently serving as a makeshift staging area for the new tenant. My breath caught slightly as the camera clearly picked up what DeAndre was looking at. Draped casually over the back of one of the solid wood dining chairs was a heavy black Kevlar tactical vest. It was thick and rigid, designed to stop high-caliber ballistic rounds. DeAndre froze. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes tracking the bold, reflective yellow lettering stitched across the back panel of the armor. U.S. Marshal. I watched the blood rapidly drain from DeAndre's face. The color vanished from his cheeks, replaced by an ashen pallor of sheer, unadulterated terror. Resting on the table right next to the tactical vest was a secured, encrypted government communication radio, a pair of heavy steel handcuffs, and a manila folder bearing the official seal of the Department of Justice. DeAndre was a 33-year-old African-American man in the United States. He knew exactly what it meant to be standing inside a broken-into luxury apartment filled with federal law enforcement gear. He understood the lethal, unforgiving reality of his situation in a way that my privileged, completely delusional sister never could. He was not just facing a misunderstanding. He was an unauthorized intruder inside the restricted residence of a federal agent. The racial and social implications hit him with the force of a freight train. One wrong move, one sudden noise, and his life could end in a barrage of federal gunfire. In the back of the Uber, my corporate crisis training kicked into maximum overdrive. I swiped down on my phone screen and firmly tapped the screen record icon. A small red dot appeared in the upper corner of my display, confirming that I was capturing every single frame of high-definition video streaming from the penthouse camera. I was no longer just a spectator watching a family dispute. I was a prime witness documenting a federal crime scene. I needed this footage preserved perfectly. When the authorities eventually questioned how a broken door and two intruders ended up in a highly classified apartment still technically linked to my name, this video would be my absolute legal shield. It proved I was nowhere near the building, and it proved Brittany had executed the breach entirely on her own initiative. DeAndre snapped out of his paralyzed state. He spun around, his eyes wide and frantic, searching for his wife. Brittany was standing near the kitchen island, adjusting her hair in the reflection of a stainless steel appliance, still talking to her live audience. DeAndre rushed over to her. He did not care about the live broadcast. He reached out and grabbed her arm, pulling the phone away from her face. Brittany instantly scowled, ripping her arm out of his grasp and glaring at him for ruining her shot. The security camera did not pick up the audio, but the urgency in DeAndre's body language screamed through the screen. He was pointing frantically toward the dining room table. He was mouthing the words, "We need to leave right now." He grabbed her shoulder again, trying to physically pull her toward the foyer and the open door. Brittany shoved him away, rolling her eyes with massive, exaggerated annoyance. She pointed at her phone, clearly telling him to shut up because she was talking to her followers. She refused to look at the dining room table. She refused to acknowledge the reality of the room. She simply turned her back on her terrified husband and began walking deeper into the apartment, heading straight down the short hallway that led to the master bedroom suite. DeAndre stood frozen in the kitchen, paralyzed by the conflicting instincts to run for his life or drag his wife out by force. I kept the screen recording active. My eyes locked on the live feed as Brittany approached the closed door of the master bedroom, entirely oblivious to the federal nightmare waiting just inches away. My finger hovered over the screen, ready to switch camera angles, when a sudden movement on the hallway feed caught my eye. The heavy brushed steel doors of the private elevator parted silently. A man stepped out into the softly lit corridor. Even through the grainy resolution of the security camera, his presence commanded immediate attention. This was David Cole. He wore dark tactical cargo pants and a plain black fitted shirt, carrying a heavy duffel bag slung over one broad shoulder. He moved with the slow, deliberate exhaustion of a man who had just finished a grueling 72-hour protection detail. He looked down at his keys, completely unaware that his secure sanctuary had just been compromised. I watched him take 5 steps down the hall before he froze. His posture changed in a fraction of a second. The exhaustion evaporated instantly, replaced by the razor-sharp instincts of a highly trained federal agent. He dropped his duffel bag silently onto the carpet. His eyes locked onto the splintered wood and warped metal of the doorframe. He saw the heavy steel pry bar lying carelessly on the floor where my sister had discarded it. He recognized the signs of a forced entry immediately. In my line of work, we study human reactions during high-stress events. Most people panic. Most people freeze or retreat. David Cole did neither. He executed a flawless tactical response. His right hand dropped to his hip in a fluid, practiced motion. He drew his matte black service weapon, keeping the muzzle pointed downward, but ready. He moved toward the door with terrifying, silent precision. He did not call out. He did not ask if anyone was inside. He was a United States Marshal assigned to a classified federal operation, and he was treating this breach as a direct threat to national security. I toggled the security application back to the interior foyer camera, my heart hammering against my ribs. The rain continued to pound against the roof of my Uber, but the sound faded into the background. I was entirely consumed by the silent, high-definition drama unfolding on my small screen. Inside the penthouse, DeAndre was still glued to the floor in the kitchen area. His eyes were wide with panic, darting between the tactical gear on the dining table and the hallway where his wife had just disappeared. He was completely paralyzed by fear, trying to figure out how to extract himself from a nightmare that he had never agreed to enter. Then the damaged front door pushed open the rest of the way. David Cole stepped across the threshold. He moved with swift, calculated aggression, sweeping the entryway with his service weapon drawn. His eyes scanned the room, instantly assessing the environment. He saw the cardboard moving boxes. He saw his own tactical vest draped over the chair. And then he saw DeAndre. DeAndre did not hesitate for a single microsecond. The moment he registered the armed federal agent stepping into the room, his survival instincts kicked in. As a black man caught inside a breached luxury apartment, he knew exactly how close he was to losing his life. DeAndre immediately dropped to his knees. He raised both of his hands high into the air, lacing his fingers behind his head. His mouth was moving frantically. Even without an audio feed, I knew exactly what he was saying. He was pleading for his life, begging the agent not to shoot, declaring that he was unarmed and had no intention of hurting anyone. David kept his weapon leveled, assessing DeAndre's complete surrender, but his peripheral vision remained active. He knew the apartment was not clear. Down the short hallway, Brittany finally realized she was no longer the only person in the room. The heavy thud of the front door opening and DeAndre's sudden movement must have caught her attention. She spun around, stepping out of the master bedroom corridor and back into the main living space. She was still holding her smartphone high in the air, the camera lens pointed directly at the scene unfolding in the living room. She was still actively broadcasting to her social media followers. Any normal, rational human being would have seen a heavily armed man in a tactical stance and immediately dropped to the floor, just like DeAndre had done. But my sister was not rational. She was insulated by a lifetime of extreme privilege and parental shielding. She had never been held accountable for a single mistake in her entire life. In her warped, narcissistic reality, she was the main character, and everyone else was just an extra who was ruining her scene. Brittany did not drop her phone. She did not raise her hands. Instead, she took an aggressive, indignant step forward. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated outrage. She pointed her free hand directly at the armed federal agent, her mouth wide as she screamed at him. "Who are you? Get out of my sister's apartment right now. I am calling the police." I watched the screen, my breath trapped in my lungs. She was actually threatening a United States Marshal with arrest. She believed her manufactured authority superseded his federal badge. She was broadcasting a felony to the internet, complaining that an armed officer was trespassing in a home she had just violently broken into. David Cole did not flinch. He did not lower his weapon. He did not engage in a petty argument with a screaming intruder. He operated purely on protocol and federal law. With his left hand, he reached into his tactical pants pocket and whipped out a leather wallet. He flipped it open with a sharp snap of his wrist, exposing the gleaming silver star of his federal badge. He thrust it forward, making sure it was clearly visible to both intruders. His mouth moved in sharp, forceful commands. The sheer authority radiating from his posture was unmistakable. He was issuing a lawful order. "Federal agent, drop the phone and get on the ground. Get on the ground right now." DeAndre pressed his forehead against the hardwood floor, making himself as small and non-threatening as possible. He was physically trembling, fully grasping the absolute severity of the situation. He was trapped in a federal crime scene, and his wife was actively escalating the danger. I kept my finger pressed firmly against the screen record button, ensuring every single frame of this encounter was saved to my encrypted cloud storage. My mind raced through the legal statutes I had studied during my years in crisis management. Brittany had already committed breaking and entering. She had damaged property belonging to the federal government. And now she was actively refusing to comply with the lawful commands of a United States Marshal during a high-stress breach. Every second she remained standing, every second she continued to hold that phone and scream at him, she was adding another layer of federal charges to her rap sheet. She was digging a hole so deep that our parents' money and influence would never be able to pull her out. I watched her mouth continue to move in angry, defiant bursts. She was actually trying to argue with him. She was trying to debate her right to be there while staring down the barrel of a federal agent's service weapon. The absolute disconnect from reality was staggering. I sat back against the leather seat of the Uber, my pulse pounding a steady rhythm in my ears. The point of no return had completely vanished in the rearview mirror. My sister had just declared war on the federal government, and she had brought her innocent husband straight into the crossfire. I watched my sister take another aggressive step forward. The distance between her and Marshal David Cole was closing rapidly. Brittany was completely blinded by her own manufactured privilege. She was not seeing a highly trained law enforcement officer. She was seeing a customer service representative who was standing in the way of her luxury penthouse tour. She thrust her phone right into his face, ensuring her live broadcast captured every second of her spectacular meltdown. I could clearly read her lips as she continued her tirade. She demanded his name, his badge number, and his immediate eviction from what she kept calling her property. David maintained his tactical stance. He did not let her aggression bait him into a reckless move. He kept his service weapon pointed at a safe low angle, giving her every possible opportunity to recognize the silver badge he was holding out. He repeated his lawful command, his voice undoubtedly echoing through the foyer. "Federal agent, get on the ground now." But Brittany had never been told no. In a move of pure, unadulterated insanity, she raised her free hand. She swatted at the air, aiming directly for the hand holding the federal badge. She actually made physical contact. She slapped the wrist of a United States Marshal in the middle of a high-security breach. The instant her hand made contact with him, the entire dynamic of the room shifted. David Cole ceased issuing verbal warnings. He moved with a sudden fluid explosiveness that the security camera could barely track. In one seamless motion, he holstered his weapon and closed the remaining distance. He grabbed Brittany's outstretched arm, twisted it sharply behind her back, and swept her legs out from under her. Brittany hit the hardwood floor with a heavy thud. Her smartphone flew out of her hand, skidding across the polished wood and spinning to a stop against the baseboards. The camera lens ended up angled perfectly toward the kitchen, capturing a sideways but incredibly clear view of the ongoing chaos. Brittany immediately started screaming, thrashing against the agent's iron grip, completely failing to understand that resisting only made things worse. David pinned her firmly to the floor with his body weight. He reached down to his tactical belt with his free hand. I saw him press a specific orange button on his encrypted radio. It was a federal panic alarm, a direct lifeline to the highest levels of law enforcement. That single button press instantly broadcast an officer in distress signal to every regional agency. The response would be massive, armed, and immediate. While Brittany shrieked and struggled, DeAndre remained completely immobilized on the kitchen floor. He had witnessed the entire physical altercation, and the sheer terror on his face was agonizing to watch. He knew that any sudden movement on his part could be interpreted as an attack. He kept his hands locked tightly behind his head, his forehead pressed so hard against the floor it looked painful. I watched his mouth move in rapid, desperate bursts. He was practically shouting to make himself heard over his wife's hysterical screaming. He was telling Marshal Cole that he was unarmed. He was repeating over and over that he had absolutely no weapon, that he had no intention of fighting, and that he was completely unaware of the situation. I could read his lips forming the exact words that would save him. I was lied to. My wife told me her sister gifted us the lease. I did not know anyone lived here. Please do not shoot. David held Brittany firmly in place, pulling a heavy steel handcuff from his belt and snapping it around one of her wrists. He then turned his head slightly toward DeAndre. Even in the middle of a physical struggle with an uncooperative suspect, the marshal was constantly evaluating threats. He assessed DeAndre's completely submissive posture, the lack of any visible weapons, and the desperate, honest plea for mercy. David did not move to handcuff DeAndre right away. He kept his focus on securing Brittany, acknowledging that the man on the floor was currently neutralized by his own compliance. Sitting in my Uber, my fingers still holding down the screen record button, a profound sense of relief washed over me. Not for my sister, who was currently earning every second of her federal arrest, but for DeAndre. He had done exactly what he needed to do to survive. He had separated himself from her madness. And thanks to the voicemails safely stored in my encrypted cloud drive, I had the undeniable proof to back up every single word he was saying. Brittany, meanwhile, was making her situation exponentially worse. With one wrist cuffed, she continued to writhe and kick. She was screaming that her father was a wealthy businessman, that her sister was a highly paid executive, and that she was going to sue the federal government for assault. She was utterly incapable of grasping the reality that her privilege held zero currency in the face of a federal felony. She had escalated a simple trespassing charge into breaking and entering, and then topped it off with the direct physical assault of a federal officer. Her smartphone was still resting against the baseboard, actively broadcasting her entire downfall to her social media following. Every entitled scream, every attempt to resist arrest, every demand for special treatment was being transmitted live to the internet. She was creating a permanent public record of her own criminal behavior. I watched the scene unfold with the clinical detachment of a professional assessing a neutralized threat. For 34 years, my family had operated under the absolute delusion that rules did not apply to them. They believed they could break boundaries, demand resources, and trample over anyone who stood in their way without ever facing a penalty. My parents had spent decades cultivating this exact monster, insulating Brittany from the real world, feeding her ego until it metastasized into pure criminal arrogance. Now that arrogance had collided with a force they could not manipulate, bribe, or scream into submission. The United States justice system does not care about your follower count. It does not care about your wealthy suburban parents. And it certainly does not care about your manufactured sense of entitlement. Even through the thick glass of the Uber, I began to hear the faint, distant wail of sirens cutting through the rainy Chicago night. The panic alarm had done its job. The cavalry was coming, and they were coming fast. I watched the sideways angle of my phone screen as David finally managed to pin Brittany's other arm and secure the second handcuff onto her wrist. The sharp click of the metal locking mechanism signaled the official end of her reign as the untouchable golden child. The illusion was completely shattered for both of them, and the real nightmare was only just beginning. The wailing sirens multiplied, overlapping into a deafening chorus that seemed to shake the very pavement beneath my Uber. On my screen, the scene inside the penthouse escalated with terrifying speed. David Cole remained kneeling over Brittany, his radio crackling with intense rapid-fire communications. Less than 3 minutes after he triggered the panic alarm, the hallway security camera feed erupted into absolute chaos. The stairwell doors burst open. The private elevator doors slid apart simultaneously. A flood of heavily armed personnel surged into the corridor. Chicago Police Department officers arrived first, followed instantly by a federal tactical unit clad in dark body armor and carrying assault rifles. When a United States Marshal presses a distress button from his secure residence, the government does not send a lone patrol car to investigate a potential burglary. They send an overwhelming, highly militarized force to completely neutralize the immediate threat. The officers poured through the shattered doorway of the penthouse. Tactical lights cut through the dim shadows of the foyer. Commands were shouted with deafening volume, instantly overpowering the ongoing hysterics of Brittany. David quickly identified himself to the entry team, pointing toward DeAndre, who was perfectly still on the kitchen floor. 2 tactical officers immediately descended on him. DeAndre offered zero resistance as they pulled his arms back and secured his wrists with heavy plastic zip ties. He kept his head lowered, entirely submissive, understanding that his absolute compliance was the only thing guaranteeing his safety. Brittany, however, chose to fight the inevitable. As 2 large officers hauled her up from the hardwood floor by her handcuffed arms, she began thrashing wildly. Her designer trench coat slipped off her shoulder, dragging on the ground. She craned her neck, searching for the dropped phone that was still actively streaming her spectacular downfall. "Naomi, where are you?" she screamed, her voice cracking with a mixture of rage and sheer terror. "Call Mom and Dad right now. Tell them what these people are doing to me. Tell them this is your apartment." I watched her distorted, tear-streaked face on the live feed. She was still demanding that I swoop in and save her, entirely incapable of accepting that her own entitlement had built this cage. The officers did not care about her demands. They dragged her forcefully toward the hallway, her designer heels scraping uselessly against the expensive floor. "Call my father," she shrieked as they hauled her out the door. "My father will sue all of you. You have no idea who we are." They disappeared down the corridor surrounded by an impenetrable wall of federal agents. The apartment suddenly fell silent, save for the tactical unit sweeping the remaining rooms. I sat in the back of the car, bathed in the cold glow of the screen. My expression remained entirely unreadable. There was no joy, no sadness, just absolute finality. The consequences of their lifelong arrogance were now fully, irreversibly locked in place, forever marking the end of their toxic control. The heavy metal door of the police cruiser slammed shut, sealing DeAndre and Brittany in the cramped, plastic-lined back seat. Rain pelted the roof of the vehicle in a relentless rhythm. Up front, a thick plexiglass partition separated them from two tactical officers. The radio mounted on the dashboard crackled constantly with updates from the command center. DeAndre sat perfectly still. His hands were bound tightly behind his back with rigid zip ties. He focused on the radio chatter bleeding through the partition. He heard the officers relaying the initial charges to dispatch. They were not talking about local trespassing citations. They were listing federal code violations. He distinctly heard the terms breaking and entering a restricted federal dwelling, destruction of government property, and direct assault on a United States Marshal. Each word landed like a physical blow to his chest. He was a man who had never so much as received a speeding ticket, and he was currently sitting in a police car facing decades in federal prison. Beside him, Brittany was sobbing. She was not crying out of remorse or fear of the legal consequences. She was twisting her wrists against the heavy steel handcuffs, whining about the sharp metal scratching her skin. She looked down at her feet and let out a dramatic, frustrated wail. "Look at my shoes!" she sobbed, completely oblivious to the gravity of their situation. "These officers dragged me through the mud. These cost $1,000. Naomi is going to pay for every single scuff. When Mom and Dad get my lawyer down here, I am going to sue her and that aggressive security guard for everything they own." DeAndre slowly turned his head to look at the woman he had married. The frantic panic that had consumed him in the penthouse slowly drained away, replaced by an absolute freezing clarity. He looked at her ruined designer shoes, her smeared makeup, and the petulant, entitled scowl on her face. The illusion of his marriage shattered into a million irreparable pieces. "You lied to me," he told her. His voice was completely hollow, devoid of any warmth or affection. Brittany stopped crying for a second, glaring at him. "What are you talking about? My sister is a psycho who set us up. We are victims here." DeAndre did not raise his voice. He did not yell. He stared right through her. "You told me she gifted us that lease. You told me we were moving into a legal residence. You turned me into a felon because you wanted a penthouse for Instagram." Brittany opened her mouth to argue, but the cruiser suddenly lurched to a halt in the secured parking bay of a federal precinct. The back doors swung open. As an officer reached in to pull him out, DeAndre did not look at his wife again. He looked directly at the arresting agent. "I demand an attorney immediately," DeAndre stated with absolute resolve. "And I want to go on the record right now to fully cooperate with your investigation against her." The harsh fluorescent lights of the federal holding facility buzzed with a relentless mechanical hum. Brittany sat on a solid steel bench attached to a cinderblock wall. The stark reality of the legal system was completely lost on her. She crossed her arms over her ruined designer trench coat and glared at the heavy metal door. In her mind, this was nothing more than a massive, unacceptable customer service failure. She fully expected a high-ranking official to walk through that door at any moment, hand her a warm latte, offer a profound apology, and return her smartphone so she could update her followers on this outrageous inconvenience. She tapped her expensive scuffed heel against the concrete floor. She had demanded her one phone call over an hour ago. The federal agents had ignored her completely. They did not care about her manufactured outrage. They stripped her of her jewelry, confiscated her purse, and locked her in a windowless room. Brittany convinced herself that William and Nancy were already storming the precinct lobby. Her parents had spent her entire 31 years of life fixing every single mistake she ever made. When she crashed her first car, William bought her a new one the next day. When she failed out of her private college courses, Nancy marched into the dean's office and threatened a lawsuit until the grades were quietly expunged. Brittany believed this would be no different. She assumed her father was currently writing a massive check to the police department while her mother screamed at a shift commander to get her daughter released. She shifted uncomfortably on the cold steel, annoyed that her rescue was taking so long. She had no concept of the difference between a local municipal dispute and a federal terrorism task force facility. She began to yell at the camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling. She demanded her rights. She yelled that she had hundreds of thousands of followers who would expose this precinct. She yelled that I was going to pay for this humiliating prank. She truly believed this was all an elaborate setup designed by me to make her look foolish. The concept that she had committed an actual crime simply could not process in her brain. She looked at her manicured nails now chipped from the struggle and felt a surge of violent anger toward me. The delusion was absolute. 30 miles away, in the quiet, affluent suburbs, William and Nancy were completely oblivious to the radioactive disaster their golden child had just triggered. They sat in their spacious living room, sipping expensive wine and laughing about how quickly I must have caved to Brittany's demands. Their smug satisfaction was abruptly shattered by the sharp ring of the home landline. William picked up the receiver, expecting to hear Brittany gloating about her new penthouse view. Instead, a cold, authoritative voice cut through the line. "William, this is Special Agent Reynolds with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I am calling to inform you that your daughter Brittany is currently in federal custody at the downtown field office." William scoffed. He immediately slipped into his standard arrogant posture. He believed his wealth made him invincible. "Listen here, officer. I do not know what kind of misunderstanding this is, but you have exactly 5 minutes to release my daughter before I call my lawyers and have your badge taken away. Do you have any idea who I am?" The federal agent did not hesitate. He did not sound intimidated. He sounded like a machine executing a protocol. "Sir, I do not care who you are. This is a courtesy call from the federal government. Your daughter is not being detained for a traffic violation. She is being processed for a violent felony. She is not eligible for bail tonight." Nancy leaned close to the receiver, her face turning pale. She snatched the phone from William's hand. "What are you talking about? She was just moving into her sister's apartment. My other daughter gave her permission. Let me speak to your manager right now. I will write a check for whatever fine she owes, and we will come pick her up." "Ma'am, there is no manager to complain to Agent Reynolds," replied his voice, dropping to a chilling, absolute baseline. "You cannot buy your way out of a federal holding facility. There is no fine to pay. You are speaking to the federal government of the United States. Your daughter forcibly breached a highly restricted safe house belonging to a federal agent." The words hung in the air of the suburban living room. The heavy, impenetrable wall of their privilege finally began to crack. William grabbed the phone back, his confident bravado suddenly evaporating into raw, unadulterated panic. He realized they were not dealing with a local beat cop looking for a bribe. They were dealing with an entity that could crush their entire existence without a second thought. "What are the charges?" William demanded, his voice trembling uncontrollably. "Tell me exactly what you are charging her with." The agent read the list with absolute merciless precision. "Your daughter is being formally charged with breaking and entering a restricted federal dwelling. She is charged with destruction of government property. And she is charged with the direct physical assault of a United States Marshal during the commission of a felony." Nancy let out a loud, horrified gasp. Her legs gave out and she collapsed heavily onto the living room sofa. Assaulting a United States Marshal. The sheer magnitude of the crime was incomprehensible. This was not a minor dispute over a lease agreement. This was a direct attack on the federal government. She did not know William pleaded, his voice cracking with pure desperation. She thought it was her sister's apartment. It was a mistake. "You have to let her go. She is a good girl." "Ignorance of the law is not a defense, sir," the agent replied coldly. "And ignorance does not excuse tackling a federal officer after he has identified himself and issued lawful commands. She assaulted a marshal. These charges carry mandatory minimum sentences in a federal penitentiary. You will be notified when an arraignment date is set. Do not call this line again unless you are her retained legal counsel. The line went dead with a sharp click. William stood frozen in his pristine living room, the dial tone buzzing in his ear. Nancy began to sob hysterically, burying her face in her hands. The reality of the legal system had just smashed through their front door and obliterated their perfect, sheltered world. There was no check William could write to make this disappear. There was no local politician Nancy could call to pull a favor. They were completely powerless. For decades, they had enabled Brittany's worst impulses. They had shielded her from every consequence, nurtured her staggering entitlement, and funded her delusions. They had built a monster who believed the world existed solely to serve her. Now that monster was sitting in a federal cage, and the full, terrifying weight of the United States justice system was bearing down on her. The parental safety net was utterly destroyed. The endless nightmare had officially begun. The endless nightmare had officially begun for them. But my night was just reaching its quiet, peaceful crescendo. I unlocked the heavy, reinforced door of my new suburban home and stepped inside. The house smelled of fresh paint and polished wood. There were no memories of my late husband here, which meant there were no ghosts waiting to ambush me in the dark. It was a completely blank slate. I dropped my keys on the counter and poured myself a glass of water. I was exhausted, but my mind was completely clear. I opened my phone to verify that my screen recordings of the penthouse breach were securely backed up to multiple cloud servers. Everything was safe. The evidence was untouchable. Just as I set my phone down, the screen lit up. An incoming call from an unknown number flashed brightly. I stared at the digits. They belonged to a local Chicago area code, specifically a prefix associated with municipal and medical buildings. My crisis management instincts immediately kicked in. I assumed it was the federal authorities calling to take my official statement regarding the break-in at my former address. I cleared my throat, composed myself, and swiped to accept the call. "Hello," I answered professionally. A barrage of hysterical, ear-piercing shrieks exploded through the speaker. I actually had to pull the device away from my head. It was not a federal agent. It was my mother. Nancy and William had driven to a local hospital, likely claiming some sort of sudden medical emergency to gain access to a landline in the waiting room. They had purposely used a hospital phone to bypass the digital block I had placed on their personal cell phones. They knew I would never answer their numbers, so they manipulated a public resource just to force me to listen to their rage. "You sick girl!" My mother screamed, her voice completely unrecognizable, distorted by raw, unchecked panic and absolute fury. "You lured her into a trap. You knew the FBI lived there. You set your own sister up to be arrested." I stood in the center of my silent, empty kitchen. I did not raise my voice. I did not interrupt her tirade. I simply let her exhaust her initial burst of hysteria. William snatched the receiver from her. I could hear his heavy, ragged breathing through the microphone. "Naomi, you listen to me right now. You are going to call those federal agents and you are going to tell them this was a massive misunderstanding. You are going to tell them you gave Brittany permission to be there. You are going to fix this, or I swear to God I will ruin you. Do you hear me? You deliberately sent your sister into a federal sting operation." The sheer magnitude of their delusion was almost fascinating to witness. In the face of a catastrophic federal felony, their brains completely short-circuited. They could not accept that their golden child had committed a crime. Therefore, they had to construct a wild, impossible conspiracy theory, where I was a criminal mastermind who somehow colluded with the United States government just to punish my sister. I took a slow, measured breath. I brought the phone back to my ear. I spoke with surgical precision, my voice entirely stripped of any daughterly affection or grief. I terminated my lease legally. I stated, enunciating every single syllable, so there could be no room for their standard manipulation. I paid the penalty. I surrendered the keys. I sent a message to the family group chat explicitly stating that I no longer lived there. You read that message. Mom read that message. Brittany read that message. But you promised her the apartment, Nancy shrieked in the background. I never promised her anything, I replied coldly. Mom, you lied to her because you wanted to play the hero. You told her she could have it and she chose to believe your lie over my explicit refusal. You knew law enforcement moved in, William roared. You knew they were waiting for her. I had no idea who rented the unit after I left, I countered smoothly. Property management companies do not disclose the identities of new incoming tenants to departing residents. That is a massive security violation. I simply left. What happened after that was entirely out of my hands. But let us be absolutely clear about the facts right now. Brittany walked past a restricted access sign. Brittany ignored her husband begging her to stop. Brittany picked up a heavy steel pry bar and violently shattered a commercial security lock. Breaking into a United States Marshal's home is a felony. Assaulting a federal agent when he issues a lawful command is a felony. You set a trap for her, Nancy wailed, her voice breaking into pathetic, desperate sobs. You wanted to destroy her because you are jealous. I did not set a trap, I said, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper. I simply stepped out of the way. I removed myself from the equation. Her own entitlement was the trap. She believed she could take whatever she wanted without consequences, and you two spent 31 years teaching her that she was right. Today, the real world finally gave her a consequence you cannot buy her way out of. Naomi, please! William's voice suddenly shifted from aggressive rage to pathetic begging. He realized his threats were useless. We are your family. She is your sister. She is sitting in a federal cell. She is crying. You have to save her. DeAndre is also sitting in a federal cell, I reminded him. A hardworking man who was completely lied to by your daughter. He is facing prison time because Brittany manipulated him. Have either of you even thought about him? Have you thought about the fact that she turned her innocent husband into a felon just so she could take pictures for the internet? They were silent. Of course they had not thought about DeAndre. To them, DeAndre was just collateral damage. He was an accessory to Brittany's life, entirely expendable the moment things went wrong. Their silence validated everything I had ever known about their toxic, self-centered existence. You have the money for top lawyers, William pleaded, his voice cracking. Naomi, your husband left you that life insurance policy. You can hire the best federal defense team in the country. You can save your sister. The utter depravity of his request hung in the air. My husband Thomas, the man who had despised their treatment of me, had been dead for less than 2 weeks. His body was barely settled in the earth, and my father was actively demanding I empty the financial safety net Thomas left me to bail out the sister who broke into my home. It was the most repulsive, breathtaking display of greed I had ever encountered. No, I said. What do you mean, no? Nancy shrieked. I mean, absolutely not, I replied. I am not spending a single dime of my husband's money to defend a federal criminal. Do not ever call me again. Do not look for me. Do not expect anything from me. You chose your golden child. Now you get to pay for her. Naomi, if you hang up this phone. I pressed the red button on my screen. The call disconnected instantly. I navigated to my settings and blocked the hospital's phone number. I placed my phone face down on the granite kitchen counter. The house returned to absolute perfect silence. I had delivered the final blow. I had severed the corrupted umbilical cord that had drained my energy, my finances, and my emotional stability for my entire adult life. There would be no more negotiations. There would be no more rescue missions. I was officially free, and they were trapped in the wreckage of their own making. The morning sun cast long, sharp shadows across my new kitchen. I had slept for 10 uninterrupted hours, a deep, dreamless sleep that felt like washing away a decade of grime. My coffee had barely finished brewing when my phone rang. The caller ID displayed a blocked government number. I answered promptly. Hello, I answered professionally. Miss Naomi, a stern, gravelly voice spoke. This is Special Agent Miller with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Chicago Field Office. I am contacting you regarding a breach at a secure federal dwelling registered under your previous lease. We have 2 individuals in custody claiming you authorized their entry. Agent Miller? I replied, my voice steady and professional. I anticipated your call. I have prepared a comprehensive digital dossier containing all relevant communications and video evidence regarding that incident. Where would you like me to send it? There was a brief pause on the line. The agent was clearly unaccustomed to such swift, frictionless cooperation from a suspect's family member. Usually relatives lie obfuscate or immediately demand lawyers to shield their guilty blood. I was offering them a perfectly wrapped conviction on a silver platter. He provided a secure federal email address. I opened my encrypted cloud drive. I did not filter or censor a single file. I attached the screenshots of Brittany demanding the smart lock code. I attached the family group chat logs where I explicitly stated I no longer lived at the penthouse. I attached the high-definition screen recordings showing Brittany destroying the commercial lock with a pry bar while her husband pleaded with her to stop. Most importantly, I attached the pristine audio files of DeAndre's voicemails, the ones where he innocently thanked me for the fake lease transfer. I hit send. The transmission bar filled, and the evidence flew through cyberspace directly to the federal prosecutor's desk. "I want to be absolutely clear, Agent Miller," I stated into the phone. "I vacated that property legally. I paid the termination penalty. I informed my family I was gone. Brittany fabricated a lie to manipulate her husband into moving her boxes. DeAndre is entirely innocent. He is a victim of my sister's fraud just as much as your Marshal is a victim of her break-in." "We will review the evidence, Ms. Naomi," the agent replied, his tone noticeably warmer. "Thank you for your candor." Over the next 48 hours, the federal legal machinery ground into motion with ruthless efficiency. I hired a private attorney strictly to monitor the docket and keep me informed of the proceedings without having to speak to my parents. Through my lawyer, I learned exactly how my digital dossier dismantled my family's entire defense strategy. William and Nancy had drained a massive chunk of their retirement savings to hire a high-powered criminal defense attorney for Brittany. They assumed they could buy their way out of a federal indictment by claiming it was a simple familial misunderstanding. They expected me to cover for her. But when the federal prosecutor dumped my compiled evidence onto the defense attorney's desk during the discovery phase, Brittany's entire narrative collapsed. The federal prosecutor did not play games. They separated Brittany and DeAndre immediately. DeAndre was assigned a public defender, a sharp, overworked lawyer who immediately recognized the goldmine of exculpatory evidence I had provided. DeAndre's attorney took the audio recordings of the voicemails and the video of Brittany violently shoving DeAndre away from the door and presented them to the assistant United States attorney. The narrative was undeniable. DeAndre was a hardworking IT specialist with zero criminal record. He had been actively defrauded by his spouse. He was operating under a mistake of fact completely lacking the criminal intent required for a federal breaking and entering charge. He thought he was moving into a legally transferred apartment. Brittany had weaponized his trust. The federal prosecutor, recognizing a slam-dunk case against the primary aggressor, offered DeAndre an immediate deal. In exchange for his full, unvarnished testimony against his wife regarding her deception and her aggressive actions toward Marshal Cole, all federal charges against DeAndre would be dismissed with prejudice. DeAndre did not hesitate. He had sat in a federal holding cell for 2 days, staring at the absolute destruction of his quiet, respectable life. He had listened to Brittany scream through the cinder-block walls, demanding room service and blaming everyone but herself. The blinders had been violently ripped from his eyes. He signed the immunity agreement, provided a devastatingly detailed sworn statement detailing Brittany's lies, and was processed for release. Brittany, however, was trapped. The evidence I provided proved premeditation. She brought the pry bar. She ignored my text stating I had moved. She struck a federal agent. Her high-priced lawyer informed William and Nancy that taking this to trial would result in a guaranteed maximum sentence. The golden child was cornered, stripped of her privilege, and facing the terrifying reality of a federal penitentiary. On Wednesday evening, I was sitting on my back patio, watching the sunset paint the suburban sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. The air was crisp and clean. My phone vibrated softly on the glass table. It was a text message from DeAndre. I opened it expecting a long, complicated explanation, or perhaps a lingering defense of the woman he had loved. Instead, I found exactly 2 sentences. They were stark, honest, and heavy with the weight of a man who had just barely survived a catastrophic collision with my toxic family. "Thank you for the truth," the message read. "I have filed for divorce." I locked my phone and set it down. DeAndre was free. He had walked through the fire and managed to keep his life intact, severing his ties to the poison that had infected my family for decades. He was collateral damage who managed to escape. I took a deep breath of the cool evening air, feeling the profound satisfaction of justice taking its natural course. The final unavoidable reckoning for my sister and my parents was fast approaching, and I was perfectly positioned to watch their empire of lies crumble into dust. Less than 48 hours after DeAndre secured his freedom, the brutal reality of the federal justice system slammed directly into my parents' bank accounts. For their entire lives, William and Nancy had operated under the assumption that their upper-middle-class suburban wealth made them invincible. They believed that having a nice house, 2 luxury cars, and a healthy retirement portfolio meant they could simply buy their way out of any inconvenience. They were about to learn the terrifying difference between local municipal fines and the crushing, bottomless pit of federal criminal defense. Desperate to rescue their golden child from a cinderblock holding cell, my parents sought out the most aggressive, high-profile federal defense attorney in Chicago. They managed to secure a consultation with a man named Harrison Caldwell, a ruthless legal shark known for representing corrupt politicians and cartel bosses. They walked into his towering glass office expecting to be treated like VIPs. They expected Caldwell to pat them on the back, take a modest check, and make the entire ordeal magically disappear before the weekend. Caldwell did no such thing. He did not offer them coffee. He did not offer them false hope. He sat behind his massive desk and pulled up the digital discovery file that the federal prosecutor had already provided. He pulled up the exact same encrypted evidence dossier I had compiled. Caldwell turned his monitor around to face my parents. He played the high-definition security footage of Brittany swinging a heavy steel pry bar into a commercial security lock. He played the footage of Brittany actively slapping the wrist of a highly trained United States Marshal. He read aloud the text messages where she explicitly detailed her plan to ignore my warnings and force entry into the penthouse. When the presentation ended, my mother attempted her usual routine. She started crying, claiming Brittany was just confused that she was a good girl who made a tiny mistake under pressure. Caldwell silenced her with a raised hand. He bluntly informed them that this was not a shoplifting charge. He explained that assaulting a federal agent carries a mandatory minimum sentence, and the prosecution had indisputable high-definition video evidence of the crime, supplemented by the sworn testimony of both the federal agent and her own husband. The case was completely unwinnable at trial. William, trying to regain a sense of control, asked how much it would cost to get the charges dropped. Caldwell laughed. He told my father that federal prosecutors do not drop charges when an agent is assaulted on duty. The only path forward was negotiating a plea deal to slightly reduce her inevitable prison sentence. And to even begin that process, Caldwell demanded an upfront, non-refundable retainer of $150,000. He made it crystal clear that the fee was just to walk into the courtroom and review the paperwork. If it went to trial, the cost would easily triple. The demand struck my parents like a physical blow. $150,000 in pure liquid cash was not something they simply had sitting in a checking account. They were entirely house poor. For a decade, they had relentlessly funded Brittany's extravagant influencer lifestyle. They had co-signed her luxury vehicle loans, paid off her maxed-out credit cards, and subsidized her designer wardrobe to maintain the illusion of her success. Their actual cash reserves were completely depleted. To raise that kind of money overnight, they would have to take a massive early withdrawal from their retirement accounts, incurring catastrophic tax penalties, or they would have to take out a second mortgage on their heavily leveraged suburban home. The financial devastation of their toxic parenting had finally arrived to collect its due. They were staring down the barrel of total bankruptcy, all to fund the defense of a daughter who was guaranteed to serve time in a federal penitentiary, regardless of how much money they spent. Panic is a powerful catalyst for depravity. Cornered by the sheer magnitude of the retainer fee, my father's mind scrambled for a lifeline. He could not fathom sacrificing his own hard-earned retirement. He could not stomach the idea of losing his status symbol home. Instead, his twisted logic immediately zeroed in on the one person who always served as the family ATM. He thought of me. More specifically, he thought of my dead husband. I was sitting at my kitchen island sipping black coffee and reviewing a client contract when my phone screen lit up. I had unblocked their numbers strictly to monitor their inevitable escalation, knowing that a desperate narcissist is a highly predictable creature. I opened the text message from William. The sheer breathtaking audacity of his words practically burned through the glass screen. Naomi, we are in a massive crisis. The lawyer needs $150,000 by tomorrow morning to keep your sister out of general population. I know Thomas had that massive corporate life insurance policy. You need to wire the retainer fee to my account immediately. It is your duty to fix this since you caused it. If you do not transfer the funds today, I will make sure the entire family knows you let your sister rot in jail while you hoard dead money. Do not test me. I read the message twice. My husband had been buried for exactly 13 days. The soil on his grave was barely settled. And my father was aggressively demanding that I liquidate the financial protection Thomas had carefully arranged for my future, all to bail out the woman who broke into a federal safe house. He was weaponizing my grief, attempting to extort me using the threat of public family shame. A year ago, a message like that would have sent me into a spiral of anxiety. I would have agonized over the guilt, terrified of being ostracized by the extended family, desperately trying to find a compromise to keep the peace. But the woman who used to bend to their will had died the moment they left her stranded at O'Hare Airport. I did not type out an angry response. I did not engage in a debate about morality or financial boundaries. I opened my mobile web browser and navigated directly to the official digital database of the Illinois General Assembly. I scrolled down to the specific criminal code regarding financial extortion and blackmail. I highlighted the legal definition, which explicitly outlines the severe felony penalties for anyone who attempts to obtain currency or assets from another person by threatening to expose them to hatred, contempt, or public ridicule. I took a clean, high-resolution screenshot of the legal statute. I switched back to the text thread with my father. I attached the screenshot of the felony extortion law. I did not add a single word of commentary. I did not type a greeting or a sign-off. I simply hit send. I watched the read receipt appear at the bottom of the screen. I pictured William standing in his living room, staring down at his phone, waiting for a wire transfer confirmation, only to receive a direct, indisputable threat of a criminal indictment. The silence that followed was absolute. No furious phone calls. No follow-up texts. The realization had finally pierced his arrogant skull. I was no longer their victim. I was a heavily armed adversary, and they were completely out of ammunition. But desperation breeds a very specific kind of stupidity. My father, stripped of his digital leverage and backed into a financial corner, decided to escalate the conflict from the virtual world to the physical one. He thought he could ambush me. He assumed he could walk into my workplace, cause a massive, humiliating public scene, and shame me into writing a check just to make him go away. At 10 o'clock the next morning, William drove his luxury sedan from the suburbs straight into the heart of downtown Chicago. He marched into the towering glass and steel high-rise where my crisis management firm was headquartered. He bypassed the digital directory and strode directly up to the main security desk. He slapped his hands down on the polished marble counter and aggressively demanded that the receptionist call me down to the lobby immediately. When the receptionist politely asked for his name and the nature of his appointment, William completely lost his temper. He started shouting that he was my father, that I was hoarding money while my sister was in jail, and that he was not leaving the building until I came downstairs to face him. He wanted an audience. He wanted the passing executives, the wealthy corporate clients, and my professional peers to hear his twisted narrative. He wanted to weaponize my professional reputation against me, holding my career hostage until I surrendered my husband's life insurance policy. There was just one massive, embarrassing flaw in his brilliant tactical strike. I was not in the building. I had not been in that building for over 8 months. When I ascended to the position of senior crisis consultant, I negotiated a fully remote contract. My physical office was the secured quiet room in my new suburban home. William was throwing a spectacular red-faced tantrum in the middle of a corporate lobby for a daughter who was sitting 20 miles away drinking coffee in sweatpants. The head of building security, a retired police lieutenant, did not tolerate screaming matches in his pristine lobby. He calmly informed William that I was not on the premises. William, completely unhinged by the stress of Brittany's impending federal indictment, accused the security director of lying to protect me. He attempted to push past the security turnstiles to access the executive elevators. That was his final fatal mistake. The security guards instantly intercepted him. They grabbed him by the arms, spun him around, and physically frog-marched him backward across the polished marble floor. My father, a man who prided himself on his pristine country club image and flawless social standing, was publicly manhandled out the revolving glass doors and dumped onto the wet Chicago sidewalk in front of dozens of shocked onlookers. The security director immediately flagged my profile and sent an automated alert to my firm's human resources department, properly documenting the disturbance. 10 minutes later, my corporate managing partner called me to explain the bizarre situation. She assured me the building had permanently banned William from the premises and offered to provide the security footage if I needed to file a formal police report. I thanked her, requested the video files for my personal records, and hung up the phone. The physical escalation was the absolute limit. William showing up at my place of employment proved that a simple blocked phone number was not going to stop them. They were like drowning people, willing to pull anyone down with them to keep their heads above water. I needed to build a fortress of legal concrete around my life, one they could never breach without facing immediate jail time themselves. I contacted my personal attorney. I told him I needed a formal, merciless cease and desist letter drafted and hand-delivered to my parents' suburban home before sunset. I did not want vague legal jargon that left room for interpretation. I wanted a brutal mathematical dissection of their reality. I dictated the exact terms to my lawyer, ensuring that every sentence struck with lethal, undeniable precision. The letter began with a standard directive legally barring William and Nancy from any direct or indirect contact with me, my employer, my clients, or my property. It stated that any violation would result in an immediate restraining order and a civil lawsuit for harassment and emotional distress. But the second half of the document was where I delivered the ultimate killing blow. I outlined the exact math of their impending ruin. I explicitly detailed the terrifying financial reality they were actively attempting to ignore. I calculated the $150,000 retainer demanded by Harrison Caldwell. I added the estimated $300,000 in trial fees that would accumulate over the next year of grueling federal litigation. I listed the current market value of their heavily leveraged suburban home, noting that taking out a second mortgage at the current exorbitant interest rates would instantly double their monthly overhead and render them completely house poor. I broke down the massive federal tax penalties they would incur by prematurely liquidating their retirement portfolios to generate liquid cash. I forced them to look at the numbers in black and white. I stated that even if they drained every single cent they had ever saved, sold their luxury cars, and mortgaged their home to the absolute hilt, Brittany was still facing a federal judge with a conviction rate of 99%. The high-definition video evidence of her destroying government property and assaulting a United States Marshal was totally insurmountable. They were going to bankrupt themselves for a lost cause. They were going to lose their house. They were going to lose their retirement fund, and they were still going to lose their daughter to the federal prison system. I concluded the legal document with a final, unyielding statement designed to sever all emotional ties. Your financial devastation is the direct result of your own toxic parenting. You built a criminal, and now you must pay the invoice entirely on your own. I am no longer your safety net. I am no longer your daughter. Do not ever look for me again. I authorized the final draft. My lawyer dispatched a licensed process server to deliver the document directly into William's hands at exactly 4 o'clock that afternoon. The server required a signature of receipt, ensuring there could be absolutely no deniability in court. My father was forced to sign his name on the very document that severed our bloodline forever. When the delivery confirmation pinged on my phone, I felt a profound, heavy silence settle over my house. The war was officially over. I had systematically dismantled their avenues of attack, stripped away their financial extortion, and legally barricaded my existence from their toxic reach. They were now entirely isolated, trapped in a rapidly collapsing world of their own design, left to face the horrific consequences of their golden child's entitlement without a single lifeline to grab onto. I did not attend the federal trial. My physical presence in that downtown courtroom was exactly what my family desperately craved. William and Nancy wanted me sitting in the gallery so they could shoot venomous glares at the back of my head. Brittany wanted me on the witness stand so she could weep and point a manicured finger at her cruel, wealthy sister. They needed a villain to anchor their delusion. By refusing to show up, I starved them of their audience. I let the cold, mechanical gears of the United States justice system grind them down without my participation. Instead of sitting on a hard wooden bench in a sterile federal building, I paid a transcription service to send me the official court records at the end of each day. I preferred reading the black and white text. Transcripts strip away the theatrical sobbing and the manipulative tone inflections. They reduce a person's lies to plain text on a page, exposing exactly how pathetic those lies sound when subjected to the unforgiving light of federal law. 3 months later, sitting on the sunlit patio of my secure suburban home, I opened the heavy manila envelope containing the final sentencing transcript. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, leaned back in my chair, and began to read the exact moment my sister's entitlement collided with a federal judge. According to the typed pages, Brittany attempted to deploy her ultimate weapon. She tried to weaponize her tears. The court reporter diligently noted her sobbing during her time on the stand. Brittany spun a wild, incoherent narrative for the court. She claimed she was a victim of a malicious sibling rivalry. She testified under oath that I had tricked her into going to the penthouse, that I had explicitly told my mother the apartment was hers, and that she only used the pry bar because she thought I was inside experiencing a mental health crisis and ignoring her out of spite. She literally tried to rebrand a felony break-in as a frantic welfare check. The federal prosecutor completely dismantled her defense in less than 5 minutes. The prosecutor did not yell or badger her. He simply played the security footage. The transcript detailed the absolute silence in the courtroom as the judge watched Brittany violently smash the electronic smart lock. The prosecutor asked Brittany if people conducting welfare checks usually pause to broadcast their luxury lifestyle to their social media followers before checking on their supposedly distressed relatives. Brittany had no answer. Her silence on the record was deafening. Then the prosecutor brought up DeAndre. DeAndre had testified earlier in the trial utilizing the immunity deal he secured through my audio backups. He testified that Brittany explicitly told him I had gifted them the lease. He confirmed under oath that Brittany shoved him away when he begged her to stop destroying the door. The prosecutor cornered Brittany with her own husband's sworn words. She was trapped. Even reading the dry text, I could picture the exact moment my parents realized their money was useless. The defense attorney they had bankrupted themselves to hire tried to object, tried to claim temporary insanity brought on by family stress, but the prosecutor swiftly shut it down. The evidence was simply too absolute to be argued away by expensive lawyers. The most satisfying part of the transcript was the closing statement from the presiding federal judge. Judge Harrison was a no-nonsense jurist with a reputation for handing out maximum penalties for violent offenses. He had absolutely zero patience for suburban family drama bleeding into his federal courtroom. I read his exact words, savoring every single syllable. The judge addressed Brittany directly. He stated that in his 30 years on the bench, he had rarely seen a defendant display such a staggering lack of remorse or basic connection to reality. He systematically dismantled her entire victim narrative for the public record. He reminded her that she bypassed a restricted access perimeter. He noted the heavy steel pry bar she retrieved specifically to destroy government-secured property. But the killing blow was his summary of her interaction with Marshal Cole. The judge stated that when confronted by a highly trained law enforcement officer, Issuing lawful commands and displaying a federal badge, her instinct was not to comply. Her instinct was to physically assault him. The judge told Brittany that her profound privilege had blinded her to the consequences of her actions. But the federal court was not her parents' living room. There would be no shielding her here. The justice system demands accountability, and her arrogance had finally run its course. Because the charges included the direct physical assault of a federal officer during the commission of a felony, the legal parameters were brutally rigid. Federal sentencing guidelines carry strict mandatory minimums. There was no room for leniency, no option for probation, and no chance of house arrest. The judge brought his gavel down with absolute finality. He sentenced Brittany to 3 years in a federal penitentiary. Furthermore, because it was a federal conviction for a violent offense against an agent of the state, she was entirely ineligible for early parole. She would serve every single day of those 36 months behind bars. The court reporter noted an outburst from the gallery at the moment the sentence was read. Nancy had stood up and screamed at the judge, resulting in a swift reprimand and an order for bailiffs to remove her from the courtroom. Even in the face of federal authority, my mother could not control her toxic impulses, but it did not change the outcome. I closed the thick transcript and set it on the glass patio table. The paper felt heavy with justice. The undeniable truth of her fate was sealed in official ink, forever marking the end of her golden child reign. 6 months passed since the heavy wooden gavel fell in that downtown courtroom. The changing seasons brought a brutal, unrelenting winter to the Chicago area, perfectly mirroring the harsh, freezing reality that had finally consumed my parents. Karma had fully materialized, executing its judgment with a flawless mathematical precision that no amount of crying, negotiating, or complaining could ever undo. William and Nancy were utterly bankrupted by their relentless crusade to save the unsavable. The exorbitant retainer fees, the endless billing hours from their high-profile defense attorney, and the staggering restitution costs completely drained their retirement accounts. To avoid total financial collapse, they were forced to list their sprawling suburban home on the market at a massive, humiliating loss. The pristine fortress where they had cultivated Brittany's staggering entitlement was sold to an anonymous buyer. They packed up the remnants of their luxurious facade and relocated to a cramped, poorly insulated 2-bedroom apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. I learned through my attorney that they now spent their days suffocating in close quarters, trapped with nothing but their crushing debt and the overwhelming silence of their ruined legacy. DeAndre navigated this fallout with remarkable quiet resilience. Armed with the digital evidence I had willingly provided, he swiftly finalized his divorce proceedings. He severed every legal tie to my sister before the ink on her federal conviction was even dry. Because his name had been cleared so definitively by the prosecutor, his high-level security clearance and professional reputation remained completely intact. He kept his lucrative IT career and excised my toxic family from his existence with surgical precision. We never met in person again, but he sent a brief formal email to my lawyer, ensuring I knew the divorce was completely final. He was a good man who survived a terrible collision, and I was genuinely glad he escaped the wreckage. As for Brittany, the reality of a federal penitentiary systematically stripped away her carefully curated influencer persona. There were no ring lights, no designer trench coats, and absolutely no digital followers to validate her existence behind those towering reinforced concrete walls. She was locked away for 3 mandatory years, reduced to a simple inmate number in a rigid system that did not care about her manufactured privilege. My parents were left with absolutely nothing. They sacrificed their financial security, their elite social standing, and their comfortable retirement to indulge a dangerous monster of their own making. They traded their entire future to defend a daughter who ultimately went to federal prison anyway. They had spent 34 years treating me as a disposable asset while pouring every available resource into their golden child. Now their golden child was locked in a federal cage, and the disposable asset was thriving completely out of their reach. The scales of justice perfectly balanced themselves. I watched the winter snow fall through the massive windows of my secure home, feeling the absolute closure of a battle I finally won. The brutal winter eventually thawed into a crisp, forgiving spring. I stepped out onto the sprawling balcony of my new, heavily secured home, located deep within an undisclosed Chicago suburb. The commercial-grade electronic gates at the end of my private winding driveway ensured that my sanctuary remained entirely impenetrable. I held a steaming mug of black coffee, resting my forearms against the cool metal railing, and looked out over the dense, quiet forest that completely shielded my property from the outside world. For the very first time in my 34 years of life, I felt genuine, unfiltered peace. The profound silence of my new reality was a stark contrast to the relentless, demanding chaos I had endured for decades. My smartphone no longer vibrated with urgent demands for money, emotional blackmail, or hysterical threats. My digital life was completely clear of toxic manipulation. By treating my family like a hostile corporate entity and executing a ruthless exit strategy, I had surgically excised the parasite that had fed on my success. The resulting freedom was intoxicating. The loss of my husband Thomas still carries a heavy, undeniable ache in my chest. Some mornings I wake up reaching for him, forgetting for a split second that his side of the bed is empty. But the grief I navigate today is pure and honest. It is no longer polluted by the suffocating weight of my parents' greed or my sister's staggering entitlement. I can finally mourn the man I loved with the quiet, uninterrupted dignity he truly deserved. Thomas was the one who consistently begged me to draw a hard, unforgiving line with my blood relatives. He saw the psychological damage they inflicted on my spirit long before I was ready to admit it to myself. Building this fortress and securing my peace is the ultimate tribute to his memory. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the absolute stillness of the morning air. My career in crisis management taught me to neutralize threats, but this ordeal taught me a brutal, necessary lesson about personal self-preservation. I finally learned that boundaries are not negotiations. You do not have to explain your refusal to participate in your own destruction. You do not have to sacrifice your mental health, your financial stability, or your physical safety to prove your loyalty to people who view your success as their personal bank account. My parents and my sister believed they could break me by abandoning me at an airport during the darkest, most vulnerable moment of my life. They fully expected me to crumble and surrender. Instead, their calculating cruelty gave me the exact clarity I needed to sever the cord permanently. Sometimes the only way to defeat people who want to drain your life is to step out of the way and let them walk blindly into the traps they set for themselves. Have you ever had to walk away and let karma do the heavy lifting? Share your story in the comments.